The focus of this lecture is the Second Triumvirate, 44 BC, through the period of the Mad Caesars, 68 AD. On March 15, 44 BC, or the Ides of March, Julius Caesar was assassinated by the Roman Senate out of fear for his desire to be dictator for life or king of Rome. At Caesar's death, Rome learned that Caesar had chosen his grandnephew, now adopted as his son, Octavian, to be his heir and successor. Octavian knew about himself that he was too inexperienced, not ready for the challenges of ruling the vast Roman Republic. So, following in his father's footsteps, he formed a three-man alliance. This alliance is called the Second Triumvirate. It included Octavian, named as Caesar's heir and Caesar's son with Caesar's will, two of Caesar's favored commanders in his army, his best friend, that is Caesar's best friend, Mark Antony, and another of his commanders, Lepidus. As we saw with the first triumvirate, that first three quickly became a power struggle between just two, Caesar and Pompey. The same thing happens here with the second triumvirate. The second triumvirate quickly becomes a power struggle between Octavian and Mark Antony. Lepidus plays a minor role in the second triumvirate after 44 BC. The first action of the second triumvirate was to round up all those responsible for the death and assassination of Julius Caesar. In other words, to round up the Senate and assassinate the Senate for their assassination of Caesar. So the first job of the second triumvirate of Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus is to round up all 300 senators. They didn't want to take a chance here. They weren't going to judge whether or not a person had any part in this or not. All they knew is that the Senate was behind it, so they got rid of, meaning murdered, 300 senators. The entire Senate was wiped out, including members of their family, some of their friends, and other allies. So, with the Senate being gone here, murdered, wiped out, Octavian has to replace the Senate. And it's important for you to remember this because later when I discuss some of Octavian's title changes, titles that he takes for himself, you're going to wonder now, where's the Roman Senate? Why aren't they standing in opposition to Octavian? It's because they were hand-selected by Octavian. They were his friends and yes-men. So after the Senate is replaced with Octavian's friends, Octavian turns to his second goal, which is to oversee now the Roman Republic. It's too big for him to handle alone. So he asked Mark Antony to set up a fort and to set up shop, so to speak, over in Turkey in the eastern half of the Roman Republic. Now it's important to note that what Octavian is doing here is telling Mark Antony, the Roman Republic is mine. It belongs to me, Octavian, but I need help running it. I am not giving you half of it. All I'm asking you to do is oversee half of it, the eastern half on my account. So please look after the eastern half, but remember that it all belongs to me. So Mark Antony was eager to do his part. He went east and set up shop there, set up a fort. And his first order of business in the east was to send out messages to all of the kings and a queen in neighboring territories just outside of the Roman Republic. So what he does here is he sends messages to kingdoms at this time which are still free from Roman control. And in these messages, he tells these kings and one queen that they are to come meet with him in Turkey, and he would judge whether or not they presented a good enough case to stay free. If he was not convinced, then he would wage war against these territories and make them part of the Roman Republic. Of course, the queen that I'm referring to here is Queen Cleopatra of Egypt, the Pharaoh of Egypt, the sole ruler of Egypt, because she had been responsible for the murder of her brother Ptolemy, who ended up mysteriously drowned after Cleopatra and Caesar had spent an intimate night together. So Cleopatra receives this letter from Mark Antony, and at first she's very angered by it because she knew Mark Antony. He was one of Caesar's best friends. Mark Antony had been in Egypt when Caesar arrived chasing Pompey. She had hung out with Mark Antony at various parties while in Rome. She knew him. And for him to suggest that he might be trying to take Egypt away from her was horribly offensive. She thought, where does he get off, this Roman, suggesting he could take Egypt from me? Egypt has been around for 3,000 years. Rome is the new, inexperienced kid on the block. How dare he? And she meets with her advisors. And at first, she really thinks about sending Mark Antony a not-so-nice message, basically telling him what he could do with his request. But then she thinks, no, actually, it might be a good idea to have a Roman ally. So what she knows about Mark Antony is that he's a bit of a drunk. She knows this. He has a problem with alcohol. That he was a really fun kind of guy at parties. Not real quick to think on his own. He was the kind of guy that could be ordered about and manipulated pretty good. So, why not choose Mark Antony as her new ally over Octavian, who's so very young and inexperienced? So she does herself up as best she can. We've had this discussion before. What does she look like or what doesn't she? Well, who knows? But anyhow, she gets all fixed up, converts her flagship into a party barge, meaning that she loads her ship down with all kinds of Egyptian foods and delicacies and plenty of wine. She dresses herself as a Roman woman because she knew that Mark Antony would find that more attractive. He had never really shown any kind of indication of finding an Egyptian woman attractive, so she tried to make herself look as Roman as possible by wearing a Roman-style dress and by wearing her hair piled high in ringlets and slightly frizzy, the way Roman women wore their hair. She gave up, in other words, her Egyptian bob and was going to go for subtlety and makeup like Roman women, but then just couldn't help herself. She got very heavy-handed with her makeup, and of course one of the things we know about Cleopatra is that she wore extremely heavy eyeshadow and eyeliner. She pounded up a green gemstone called malachite, and that was her signature green eyeshadow, and she lined her eyes very heavily and dramatically with black coal eyeliner. She doused herself with her signature fragrance, which was a combination of orange peels, various citrus fruits, and some spices, so that she had sort of a spicy citrus smell about her. And she loaded her ship's sails with this perfume as well. And Mark Antony would later comment that he smelled Cleopatra before he ever saw her, that her perfume came in on the waves off the sea, and she had him seduced by her perfume before he ever even saw her or her ship. Cleopatra also dusted herself and all of her sailors, who were dressed either as Egyptian or Roman gods, and her ship in a gold shimmering powder. So she headed up to Turkey, met with Mark Antony. Whatever she looked like, the one thing we have to say about Cleopatra is that she worked very quickly on men, because within the same day that she met Mark Antony in Turkey, she left with a contract from him in which he basically was groveling. I'm so very sorry to have suggested that we could take Egypt from you. Please forgive me, blah, blah, blah. We'll leave Egypt alone. So she left with this contract, but she also left with Mark Antony's heart. She had seduced him in those few hours, and he was head over heels in love with her. So much so that shortly after she left, he abandoned his post and his job in Turkey to follow her back to Egypt. And when he got into Egypt, he boarded the party barge of Cleopatra, and he and she were seen floating up and down the Nile, drinking, overindulging in drink, in wine. He was feeding her grapes and figs and acting very un-Roman-like. Now, here's what I mean by that. True, Roman men were probably very affectionate with their wives in private. In public, Roman men frowned on PDA, or public displays of affection. To them, that was not manly, to show that you were in love with a woman or taken with a woman. So here's Mark Antony floating up and down the Nile, brushing Cleopatra's hair, rubbing her feet, massaging her back, acting very un-Roman. And these reports filter back to Rome through those trading ships that are exchanging grain and news. Octavian hears about it and is disgusted. Oh, good grief, here we go again. Another Roman general infatuated with Cleopatra. Octavian just does not see anything in Cleopatra that would make a man act so silly over her. You know, he didn't understand Caesar's fascination with her, and he certainly doesn't get what Mark Antony is doing, so he sends Mark Antony a letter. Actually, he's going to end up sending him several letters. And in these letters, he says, you're making a fool of yourself. You're not acting like a Roman man. You need to come home, or at least go back to Turkey and take up your post. If you don't do so soon, I'm going to take it that you have abandoned me in the second triumvirate, that you've abandoned Rome. And he reminds him also, hey, Mark Antony, did you forget you're already married to a Roman woman? Mark Antony sent messages back in his drunken stupor that he was not interested in coming back to Rome. He didn't care about his Roman wife. He was in love with Cleopatra. In fact, he had already married her, and she was pregnant with his child. And this is not something that most people know about Cleopatra, but yes, she was a mother to Caesarion, and also she was pregnant with a set of twins by Mark Antony and then another child. So Mark Antony's exploits in Egypt with Cleopatra undermined his reputation in Rome. Many Roman people had felt that Mark Antony was clearly much more experienced and would make a better leader than Octavian. And in 44 BC, some had figured that Mark Antony should have been in Rome, Octavian in the east. But as they hear about Mark Antony's exploits in Egypt, they begin to change their mind a bit, especially because Mark Antony is already married to a Roman wife. Here again, the Roman people don't understand the fascination that yet another Roman general has with this foreign Egyptian queen Cleopatra. Octavian, who is growing more and more ambitious every moment, sees an opportunity to use Mark Antony's mistakes against him, to use those mistakes of Mark Antony to make himself the sole leader of Rome. So he sends an ultimatum to Mark Antony, and he tells Mark Antony, you must leave Cleopatra, must leave Egypt, go back to your post in Turkey, or you risk losing your alliance with me. Mark Antony responded in letter that he had already married Cleopatra and that she was expecting his child. Now, of course, what Mark Antony has done is bigamy. In Roman times, it was against the law for a Roman man to have two wives at once, but the Romans wouldn't even recognize this marriage that he had with Cleopatra because she was Egyptian and foreign anyway. So what Mark Antony has done here is just further scandalized Rome. It is a little known fact, most people don't know about Cleopatra, that she was actually a mother. She had Caesarion first, then a set of twins by Mark Antony, a boy and a girl, and then another child with Mark Antony. So Cleopatra and Mark Antony ended up having 3 kids together. And Mark Antony was completely partying it up with Cleopatra. Well, Octavian and the Roman people felt that his actions, Mark Antony's actions in Egypt, were controversial and that he should come back to Rome and do the right thing. Mark Antony was one of those men that could be easily swayed given his moods. So when he had sobered up a bit and received yet another letter from Octavian demanding that he now come to Rome and act as a Roman husband to his Roman wife, Mark Antony had a bit of guilt, a guilty conscience over it, and he bade farewell to Cleopatra and headed off to Rome. He told Cleopatra he had to go back to Rome. He had to do the right thing. And if she was heartbroken, she didn't really show it. She probably knew that he would be back because of her hold over him. So Mark Antony went back to Rome, and when he arrived there in Rome, Octavian told him, "I've arranged for your divorce from your current Roman wife." Mark Antony thought, well, in this month's journey from Egypt to Rome, Octavian's come around. He recognizes my love and passion for Cleopatra. This is awesome, but Octavian quickly says, "This is not so you can be married to Cleopatra. This is so you will prove your loyalty to me, to the second Triumvirate, and to Rome. You will have to marry my sister. Octavia is Octavian's sister." Their parents were not especially creative, apparently, with names. So most men in Rome would have jumped and begged for the chance to have Octavia as their bride because she was beautiful and rich. But Mark Antony's heart belonged to Cleopatra. But he did the best he could, and he tried to be a husband to Octavia. He stayed with her for 3 years, but all the while he pined away for Cleopatra. He just could not get Cleopatra out of his heart and out of his mind. So he left Octavia, abandoned her, and went back to Cleopatra. This, of course, creates a bit of a problem because now Octavian has been humiliated, and so has his sister. They've both been rejected by Mark Antony. So what had been a tense situation, more or less like historians call this period from 41 to 31 BC a civil war, but initially it's just a war of words and wheels. Will you do this for me or won't you kind of thing. But after Mark Antony abandons Octavia, Octavian begins to plan war against Mark Antony. He meets with his Senate and other advisors, and they feel that war is imminent, so they begin to prepare. Meanwhile, back in Egypt, Cleopatra welcomes Mark Antony home with open arms, and they start to plot together. Why don't we take war to Octavian? He's not experienced like either of us in war. Surely we will beat him. If we win, we'll have control of Egypt and all of the Roman Republic. We would be the most powerful couple in the world, in the known world. So this is very appealing to Mark Antony, but he points out that while he has men from Rome on his side, it wouldn't nearly be enough. He doesn't have supplies and money and equipment and blah, blah, blah. And Cleopatra says, "Hey, I'm rich, no problem. Here's the Egyptian army. You train them. I'll build you a navy. Here's all the supplies, everything we need." So in September of 31 BC, Egyptian and Roman forces under the leadership of Cleopatra and Mark Antony go into battle against Roman forces under the leadership of Octavian. Actium is just off the coast of Greece. This was agreed upon battle site. Cleopatra and Mark Antony didn't want to ravage Egypt in war by fighting the Romans there, and the Romans didn't want to do damage to Italy, so they agreed to do damage to Greece. So in September of 31 BC, we have on one side Octavian and Rome, on the other, a combined force of Egyptians and Romans under Cleopatra and Mark Antony. This is a naval battle. Just as the battle gets underway, Cleopatra and Mark Antony have a problem. The Roman men refuse to take orders in battle from a woman, from Cleopatra. The Egyptians, of course, have no problem with a female ruler or commander. This is their way. Women were more liberated in Egypt than in any other ancient civilization. So Mark Antony reminded them, but she's supplied all the equipment, the ships, the money, your salaries. How can you reject her? They said, we do. We're not going to fight. She gives in. Cleopatra's fine. I'll just watch from a safe distance away. You command the army. I know you can do it. I'll just watch. So as the battle gets underway, it's evident that it's going to be a victory for Mark Antony and Cleopatra. But Cleopatra, recognizing this, decides that she will sail away back to Egypt. There's no point in sticking around to see how it turns out because these Roman men didn't want her there anyway, so she set sail. Well, Mark Antony eventually realizes, and he's engaged in hand-to-hand combat here, he's fighting in the battle. He realizes that Cleopatra's ship is no longer there. So instead of continuing to fight, he gives command to the ship's captain to set sail after Cleopatra. He just abandons the battle and leaves his combined force of Egyptian and Roman men to do their best against Octavian's forces. Well, without effective leadership, the Egyptian and Roman forces lost to Octavian. Some of them set sail away from the battle as fast as they could to avoid being captured. Some went to the side of Octavian. When Mark Antony caught up to Cleopatra at sea and boarded her ship, she was furious with him. What are you doing here? Why did you abandon your men? Well, you left and I didn't want to be without you and blah, blah, blah. And she totally and completely berated Mark Antony and said, more or less what you've done here is you've caused us a huge problem because now Octavian is going to follow us to Egypt to fight us there. So she said, when I get back to Egypt, I have things to do. You get yourself prepared for a land battle outside of Alexandria in the desert. Cleopatra's brain is working overtime here. She and Mark Antony had talked before the Battle of Actium about what if they lost. And to both of them, this was an absolute impossibility. They felt 99% sure they would win. But what about the 1% chance that they lost? Well, they were prepared for that. They knew that if they lost to Octavian, he would take them back as prisoners to Rome, parade them around in the city of Rome, make fun of them, keep them in chains, throw them in prison, execute them after torturing them slowly for a long time. So they were not going to do this. They had decided they would commit suicide. And they had experimented with Egyptian prisoners on the best way to commit suicide and had determined it was by the bite of a particular Egyptian snake called an asp, A-S-P. So Cleopatra arrived in Egypt and went to her tomb, which was under construction. At this point, she's only 39 years old. Her tomb isn't ready because she's got a long life ahead of her. So she goes to her tomb, where she finds her most trusted female and male servants. And she tells them the situation, how Mark Antony had fled the battle, how Octavian was going to give chase and would arrive outside of Alexandria, Egypt to do battle. She says, remember the plan. In case Mark Antony is not successful here, I need you to get the snake. I want you to hide it in a basket of figs. And if Octavian's soldiers are stationed around my tomb, tell him you're just bringing me a snack. So Cleopatra went through her beauty ritual, bathing herself, putting on makeup, fixing her hair, putting on elaborate jewelry and an elaborate costume, and waiting for news of what happened between Mark Antony and Octavian just outside of Alexandria in the desert. Well, Octavian shows up, and he sends a group of men into battle against Mark Antony. Meanwhile, he sends a group of soldiers to go into Alexandria and to find Cleopatra and to keep a watch on her. Octavian arrives shortly after his soldiers do. The soldiers, of course, have found Cleopatra at her tomb. Octavian addresses Cleopatra, finds her, talks to her. And he says, I hope you're not planning anything stupid here, because you and I could work out a plan. You've just made a mistake. I'm willing to forgive it. You can just say that you think Mark Antony is a joke. You can betray him, come to my side. You can come to Rome with me for a little while just to be in my parade, and then I'll let you come back to Egypt and rule Egypt. She knew he was lying. That was not his intention at all. But she told him, yeah, this sounds like a plan, sure. But she told him that she needed to find arrangements for her children, and that she needed to pack for the trip to Rome, and that she would need to rest for a while and possibly have a snack before she would be ready to go. And she said, but I want you to promise that you will not harm my children. And Octavian promised. So he left there and headed back out to the desert to watch what was happening there in the battle, and left soldiers stationed around Cleopatra's tomb. Cleopatra continues her packing, or what she says she's doing is packing for Rome. Her servants show up with the snack, figs. They show it to Octavian's soldiers. They cannot see the asp at the bottom of the basket. Cleopatra waits for news from the desert. Meanwhile, out in the desert, Mark Antony was horrified and humiliated when he gave the orders to march towards Octavian's soldiers to engage them in battle, when his men refused to fight. They had lost respect for him at Actium and refused to fight for him in the desert. So Mark Antony was defeated without ever really fighting. So at that time, a message was delivered to Mark Antony, which was a fake message, but it was a message that told Mark Antony that Cleopatra had betrayed him and had gone to Octavian's side. This was a woman that he had risked everything for, that he was in love with, was the mother of his children. He didn't know what to do. He thought for sure that Cleopatra wouldn't share her snake with him now, so he fell on his sword and tried to kill himself that way, but it was long, painful, and difficult. He was found by one of Cleopatra's aides and carried to Cleopatra. He was smuggled into Alexandria, away from the watching eyes of Octavian's soldiers. He was given to Cleopatra. He was carried into Cleopatra's tomb, and she was with him in his final moments and told him that she had not betrayed him, that that was bad information, and that she was sorry for his suffering, and that she loved him. So he died knowing that Cleopatra had not betrayed him. She then knew the time was imminent, that she must kill herself. So she asked for the asp. She took it out of the figs and allowed the asp to bite her. This, of course, caused hallucination and suffocation as the venom worked its way through her body. Her servants then took the asp and used it to kill themselves also. Octavian arrived to collect Cleopatra, but discovered Mark Antony, with a sword through his middle, stabbed himself to death, obviously. Cleopatra dead, and her servants dead, except for one who apparently did not get enough venom to kill herself. She was lingering in between life and death, and he asked of this servant, was this well done of your lady? Meaning, did Cleopatra die okay? And the woman responded, yes, as befitting a queen and pharaoh of Egypt. Octavian left the tomb, felt that he was freed of any promise to Cleopatra because she had not kept her promise to be in his parade. He came out of the tomb and remarked to one of his soldiers, there can only be one Caesar. The soldiers knew that that meant Caesarion, who may have been Caesar's son, had to be done away with. There could be no challengers or opposition for Octavian. So Caesarion was killed that day on the way to school. Octavian, however, took the 3 children of Mark Antony and Cleopatra back to Rome, where they lived out their lives. He felt no threat from Mark Antony's children. After his defeat of Cleopatra and Mark Antony, Octavian was given a new name by the Roman Senate. They changed his name from Octavian to Augustus, And it is for Augustus that the month of August is named. Augustus meaning the respected or revered or majestic one. Augustus will be the leader of Rome from 31 BC to AD 14. It is during his reign as the leader of Rome that Jesus Christ is born in the Roman province of Judea. That is why Augustus spans both sides of the timeline. Octavian, now known as Augustus after 31 BC. 31 BC to AD 14, 45 years, Augustus will be in control of Rome. That period is called the Age of Augustus. Augustus was not a consul. He had never been elected. He had assumed control over Rome based on Caesar's will, so he knew he could not call himself consul. He called himself by two new terms, princeps civitatis, which means first citizen, but from that Latin phrase we take the word prince. He also called himself imperator. From that Latin term we get the word emperor. Octavian, now calling himself Augustus, the name bestowed upon him by the Senate, becomes Prince or Emperor of Rome after the Battle of Actium. Rome, which had been opposed to monarchy since 509 BC, is now a monarchy. The first emperor or king of Rome is Augustus. So, if you were asked on the test, who is the first Roman emperor? The answer is Augustus. He takes the title emperor. Why does the Roman Senate allow this? They were handpicked and selected by Augustus. They were his friends. So Augustus is the king or emperor of Rome. This starts the period of Roman history known as the Roman Empire. We leave behind now the old republic. The old republican ways no longer exist. We now have the Roman Empire. Augustus creates for Rome a constitutional monarchy. He is the monarch, the king, the one, the sole leader. The Roman people are governed by laws contained in their constitution called the 12 Tables. To ensure that he was well respected, Augustus created a cult called Roma et Augustus, that is the cult of Augustus, ruler worship. Throughout the Roman Empire, the people are required to worship Augustus as a god on earth. His accomplishments during his reign as emperor include the addition of 40 new colonies to the Roman Empire. The first, of course, is the wealthy old civilization of Egypt. Egypt, because of Cleopatra's mistake in choosing Mark Antony, was no longer a free civilization. Augustus also set out on a beautification plan to make the architecture of Rome much prettier. He did not like the fact that most of the buildings in Rome were made of red bricks or were wooden structures. At great expense to the government, he set out to beautify the city by making all of the buildings, or the majority of them, out of white marble. He also attempted to get the Romans to return to traditional family values. In other words, what he told the Roman people was that too much emphasis had been placed recently in the news on adultery and the sexual escapades of Julius Caesar and Mark Antony in Egypt, and Romans just needed to be, he said, monogamous, to have simple family dinners rather than going out for elaborate feasts. They needed to dress simply and live simply. Well, of course, Augustus didn't practice what he preached. He was a major hypocrite. He didn't do any of these things himself. He was a philanderer and adulterer, much to his wife's dismay. One of the other things that we should point out about Augustus is that he gave government subsidy or government money to the major writers and philosophers of the period. This is known as the Golden Age of literature. The writers that received government support during the reign of Augustus were Virgil, Horace, Ovid, and Livy. Virgil, we've mentioned before, wrote one of the founding myths of Rome called the Aeneid. He also wrote a book of poetry about the farming and agricultural life called the Georgics. Horace was famous for short poems called odes. Ovid was the most popular writer of the time. He wrote a book called Ars Amatoria, that's Latin for the art of love, which was a seduction manual. It taught young men how to seduce older married women, and given that Augustus was attempting to return Rome to traditional family values, Ovid was considered to be public enemy number one. Though Augustus himself owned the art of love, thought it was hilarious and entertaining, he banished Ovid because Ovid stood out in contrast to the family values campaign. One of the other writers of the period was Livy. Livy wrote a history of Rome from the founding called Ab Urbe Candida, and the Romans actually used Ab Urbe Candida, AUC, as their system of dating. They dated all events from the founding of Rome, such as this is 1 year after the founding of Rome, 2 years after the founding of Rome, abbreviated 1 AUC, 2 AUC. But Augustus's most important achievement is the Pax Romana, which is a word or phrase that translates as the Roman peace. Augustus started a period in the Roman Empire of 200 years of relative peace and stability. Now, you're going to see that that is not entirely accurate, that the successors of Augustus are going to cause some problems for Rome, but overall this was a period of relative stability. When Augustus died of old age in AD 14, he was succeeded by his adopted son. Augustus and his wife had never had a son together. She had a son from a previous marriage, and on his deathbed, Augustus chose Tiberius as his heir and successor. The stepson of Augustus becomes the leader of Rome, the emperor of Rome, in the year 14. From 14 to 69 AD, the Roman Empire is under the control of a family clan called the Julio-Claudians. These are direct and indirect descendants of Julius Caesar and Augustus. They included Tiberius, who reigned from 14 to 37, Caligula, who reigned from 37 to 41, Claudius, who reigned from 41 to 54, and Nero, who reigned from 54 to 68. Of the Julio-Claudians, the two who were considered to be the best rulers were Tiberius and Claudius. That is because they were at least somewhat mentally sound. Caligula and Nero are commonly called the Mad Caesars. And let me explain what we mean by that phrase. Mad meaning insane or crazy, not angry. Mad has multiple meanings. Caesars meaning descendants of Caesar, but also the Roman people addressed their emperor not as Emperor Claudius or Emperor Caligula or Emperor Augustus. They called him Caesar Augustus or Caesar Tiberius. This was the common way of addressing the emperor. One would throw out his or her arm and say, "Hail Caesar," as a way of addressing the current emperor, whoever he was. So Caesar means direct or indirect descendant of Caesar, Julius Caesar, but it also means emperor. So the crazy emperors were Caligula and Nero. Now what I'm going to do here is give you a bit of information about each of them, and some of this may not be the kind of information that you would want younger audiences to hear. Some of this is a little disturbing. These individuals were totally insane. And I want to share with you some information about Caligula. Caligula was not this emperor's original name. His birth name was Gaius, but he was given the nickname Caligula, meaning little boots, because as a boy, he enjoyed wearing the large military boots of his father, who was a soldier in the Roman army and who was next in line after Tiberius to be the emperor of Rome. But Caligula's father was extremely popular among the people, whereas Tiberius was not. So Tiberius had Caligula's parents and older siblings killed. Caligula and his younger siblings were taken to the palace of Tiberius. which was off on this island just off the coast of Italy called Capri. Tiberius was so strange and into some really weird practices that he had been run out of Rome itself. The people respected him as a leader, but they did not like his personal choices in his life. Tiberius would be guilty of what we would call today pedophilia or child molestation, and he had been driven out of Rome for it. When Caligula arrived at the palace of his uncle, he became one of his uncle's favorites, and Caligula was forced actually to play a game with Tiberius. Tiberius would go swimming in his pool, and he would make little boys swim in the pool with him, and he called them his minnows, and he asked these little boys, made them nibble on him, quote unquote. So Caligula grew up in a bit of a strange environment, to say the least. His parents were murdered by his uncle, and then he was molested by his uncle. Caligula seemed to be a bit strange as a result of this. Tiberius once commented, "I'm raising a viper for the Roman people." But Caligula was mean. That's what Tiberius meant. He had a violent temper as a young boy, but he experienced some sort of mysterious illness, some kind of fever or something. We still don't know what that was. And when he recovered, Caligula was not the same young man that he was before he got sick. His temper was worse, and he was changed and really strange. Caligula, after suffering this fever, had incestual relations with multiple sisters of his younger sisters, and even wanted to marry one of them, and was about to marry one of his sisters when the Senate intervened and said, no. In Rome, we don't do incest. They do that in Egypt. We don't do that here. So they told him, you're going to be the Roman emperor when Tiberius dies. You cannot be married to your sister. You've got to pick someone else. So it's almost like Caligula was trying to be as aggravating as he could be at this point. He picked a Vestal Virgin. Now, to you that means nothing, but the Romans had these female priestesses, who were called Vestal Virgins. Their job was to conduct various ceremonies in honor of the Olympian gods, and they swore an oath of celibacy to always remain perfectly pure. In fact, the penalty for a Vestal Virgin who engaged in any kind of affection, just so much as touching a man, was that she would be buried alive. So these Vestal Virgins took their honor of celibacy, their oath of celibacy, very seriously. Caligula wanted to marry a Vestal Virgin. When the Senate said, you can't have your sister, he came up with the next worst thing. So I want a Vestal Virgin. And they weighed the options. Sister, Vestal Virgin. Okay, you can have a Vestal Virgin. Which one? He picked the oldest Vestal Virgin. Again, probably just for the shock value. So this Vestal Virgin was forgiven of her oath and allowed to marry Caligula. Caligula quickly got her pregnant and forced her to give birth publicly on the streets of Rome. And this wife gave birth to a daughter, which Caligula held up for the crowd and said, "Behold, my son, Julia." Really screwy. He recognized that the child was female, called it by a female name, but always referred to her as his son Julia. Caligula also began to dress as a woman at this point, wearing lots of makeup, women's clothing, and loads of jewelry when he would address the Senate. At one point, he built himself a huge palace, and right next door he built a palace for his horse. The only individuals who lived in that neighboring palace were people who were there to feed the horse and clean up the mess of the horse as it wandered throughout this huge marble palace. The horse apparently was bored too, just wandering around the palace, so Caligula appointed the horse to the Senate. And this, of course, was a bit much for the Roman Senate. Caligula was weird for sure, but now appointing a horse to the Roman Senate was just pure craziness. And he told the senators, "You should listen to the horse. I do. He has great ideas." So they thought he was pretty crazy. He also proclaimed himself a god on earth and required everyone to worship him. Now, that's no different than what Augustus had done, but Caligula took it a step further and was often seen in public appealing to the other gods to descend from heaven and engage in sexual relations with him. People thought Caligula was really weird, and what solidified that was his dinners. He had a reputation for throwing these elaborate dinner parties at his palace where the eating went on for hours and hours, and they ate absolutely disgusting stuff like milk-fed snails, stuffed dormice, flamingo tongues, crushed pearls in their wine, just any kind of crazy stuff he could come up with. He served it for dinner. And this was, of course, because he was rich enough to do so. He also served a Roman favorite at his dinners. This is going to gross some of you out, but the Romans liked what we would call rank or rotten meat. They called it aged. They liked their meat very fatty and slightly rotten. No, it didn't usually make them sick because they had acquired a tolerance for it. So at his dinner parties, Caligula would provide entertainment. This entertainment was that someone, you never knew who, was going to get a poisoned goblet during dinner, and of course people would watch as this person died from the poison. And some of you are thinking, well, I just wouldn't go to the party. I'm not going to risk getting that goblet and dying from poisoning. Well, if you didn't go, Caligula would have his bodyguards kill you for not accepting his invitation. So people went and took their chance with a goblet. He also staged executions during his dinners, and he would watch family members as their loved one was slowly tortured and put to death, having their intestines ripped out, various body parts cut off one at a time, that sort of thing. He was a sicko, to say the least. His motto was, "Let them hate me, so long as they fear me." Caligula, it seems, set out to be the worst leader he could be and to instill fear in his subjects so that they would respect him. Caligula was killed in 41 AD, and the Senate was behind it. They thought Caligula was too insane, too crazy to rule Rome. So in 41 AD, as he was on his way to the Forum with his Vestal Virgin wife and his son Julia, Caligula was attacked by his own bodyguard and killed. So was his wife and daughter. He was succeeded by Claudius, who we'll skip here, who was succeeded by Nero. Nero was one of the mad Caesars. Nero is famed for many reasons, or really we should say infamous for many reasons. He was a murderer. His victims included his 2 wives and his own mother, and the reason he gave for murdering his 2 wives and his mother was that they nagged him too much. What I think is especially tragic about this is that Nero stomped his second wife to death in her 9th month of pregnancy. She was due to deliver his child any day, and she made an offhanded comment about one of his performances, and I'll tell you what I mean by performances in just a bit. She made an offhand comment about one of his performances, which Nero took to be a criticism, and so he stomped her to death, literally jumped up and down on her till he killed her and killed his unborn child as well. He killed his mother in a very creative way. His mom had nagged him quite a bit, and he arranged for her to have a trip to the beach, which she liked to do, and he had engineers design a boat that would capsize and drown her. Well, unfortunately for Nero, Mom was a good swimmer, and so when the boat capsized, she was able to break free from the wreckage and swim back to shore. No longer able to contain his desire to get rid of her, he gave his soldiers an order to go into her bedroom and just stab her to death. And, of course, Nero's mother, Agrippina was her name, knew who was behind it, and as these soldiers were stabbing her, she made a request, "Stab me in the womb, for I have given birth to a monster." So he killed 2 wives, what would have been his heir, his only child, and his mother. His other victims included a new, fast-growing religious sect in the Roman Empire called Christians. More about that in our next lecture, but let's just suffice it to say that Christians in Rome were very secretive at the time, and as a result, Nero really misunderstood some of what the Christians were about. So, for example, he thought that Christians practiced incest because they called each other brother and sister. He also thought they were practicing cannibalism because of the act of communion, the belief that the bread and the wine were the body and blood of this guy, Jesus Christ, who had lived and died over in Judea, and he just thought that was weird. So Christians were repeatedly victimized during Nero's reign. Some speculate that the book of Revelations was about the reign of Nero. So Christians at this time were crucified and executed in Rome by Nero, who had, he thought, a really neat idea for how to use these crucified Christians. After crucifying the Christians, which is what Romans did to all political prisoners, they didn't just crucify Christians. So, you know, that crucifixion was a typical Roman style of execution. After the Christians were executed through crucifixion, Nero would give orders to burn them on crosses at night so that they acted as street lamps for the city of Rome. Nero also, it's believed, set fire to the city of Rome, though he blamed Christians for it. And this is a point of debate. You know, did Christians start a fire? Did Nero do it? We don't know. All we know is that Nero took pleasure in the fire because it allowed for a huge section of Rome to be cleared out of buildings, on which he then immediately started building a several hundred-acre palace for himself. So Nero supposedly, you all may have heard this legend before, supposedly he played his fiddle while Rome burned. That's an inaccurate statement, so you know the fiddle had not yet been invented. If he played any musical instrument while Rome burned, whether he burned it or the Christians burned it, he played a lyre, is what the musical instrument would have been. This brings us to Nero's whole problem. Anyway, Nero had never wanted to be the emperor of Rome. His 2 great loves in life were music and sports. Nero had never wanted to be emperor. He wanted to divide his time between being a musician and an athlete. He did not want to be emperor of Rome, so it's almost like he set out to do the worst job he could as emperor. Let me tell you a little bit about Nero's quote-unquote talents as a musician and an athlete. Nero thought of himself as one heck of a good athlete, which I find amusing because Nero was morbidly obese. Not to say he was overweight. He was extremely overweight, and yet envisioned himself as the perfect athlete, so much so that he signed up for the Olympic Games, which are still going on every 4 years in Greece. And, of course, Greece is a part of the Roman Empire at this point. So the emperor of Rome, the emperor of Greece, signs up to participate in the Olympic festival. Well, I guess it goes without saying that Nero won every single competition in the Olympic festival. You know, it's not because he was the fastest or he could jump the hurdles or anything. They were lowered for him to get over them. It was because nobody wanted to beat him. You know, they were scared to death of him because he was known as a murderer. So these athletes, you imagine it was quite a struggle because they had really trained and were in perfect shape. They had to forfeit to the Emperor Nero. Well, Nero, of course, took this as just absolute confirmation of his ability as an athlete to win the whole Olympics. I mean, gosh, he must be pretty special. So when he won the entire Olympic festival in Greece, he said he could now dedicate himself to his other love, music, because he had achieved the pinnacle of recognition for an athlete in the Roman world. He had won the Olympics. So he turned his attention to his musical career. He envisioned himself being a singer and performer. And when he first staged concerts in Rome, people went, curiosity. Wow, let's see what Nero sounds like. Might be kind of interesting. Word quickly spread, don't go. He's horrible. His concerts are terrible. He has this horribly high-pitched, nasally voice, and he goes on for hours and hours and hours. And so word spread, don't go. Well, as Nero watched the attendance in his concerts dwindle, he was aggravated, mad. So, in order to have an audience, he forced people into his arena, locked them inside, barred the gates, refused to let them out so that he would have an audience, albeit a captive audience. And he would go on and on for hours in this horrible voice. It was so bad that women would fake childbirth to get out. Men would fake heart attacks so that they could leave. So Nero considered himself to be a great musician and athlete, though he was neither, and he was a terrible leader. By 68 AD, the Roman Senate had grown weary of Nero's escapades. He was an embarrassment to the Roman Empire. In 68 AD, Nero was given the order to commit suicide or be murdered. Well, Nero chose suicide. And I can kind of sympathize with him on this. When it came time to kill himself, he struggled with it. When he would bring the dagger that he was using close to his stomach, he would chicken out. And he'd try again. I can't do it. So he tried repeatedly to kill himself and couldn't do it. And watching this was one of Nero's servants, a male servant that Nero had repeatedly and brutally raped and mistreated. And he asked this servant, would you help me with this? And the servant said, oh yeah, definitely. So we call this assisted suicide. Nero's servant kills Nero. Nero's dying words were, the world is losing a great artist. Nero died without an heir. Why? Because he had stomped his pregnant wife and the unborn child to death. This touched off a period in Roman history called the Year of the Four Emperors, 69 AD. There was no clear successor to Nero. This touched off a period of war lasting for 1 year in the Roman Empire. And that's where we end this lecture. The next lecture we'll talk about Vespasian, the man who emerges as the winner in the year 69.